This video was brought to you by the TLDR socials. Get more from TLDR by following us on Instagram and Twitter, where we post explainers that never make it to YouTube. The link is down below. So we've done a few videos on the conflict in Ethiopia before, but the TLDR of those TLDR videos begins in 1974 when Ethiopia was run by a Soviet-sponsored communist regime known as the Derg. The Derg were perhaps one of the most repressive regimes in all of human history, presiding over the now infamous Red Terror political campaign in which some 500,000 Ethiopians and Eritreans were killed over the course of a year. During their reign, child mortality was about 20%, and over 1 million people died in a single famine that lasted from 1983 to 1985. The Derg were ultimately overthrown by the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or EPRDF. The EPRDF were led by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, a guerrilla militia that came from Tigray, one of the 10 ethnic regions in Ethiopia. While Tigrayans only make up 6% of Ethiopia's population, the TPLF were by far and away the most impressive military force in Ethiopia, which is why they led the coalition. Anyway, from 1991 until 2018, the TPLF basically ruled Ethiopia via the EPRDF. The Prime Minister, Meles Zenawi, most of the intelligence and military chiefs, both patriarchs of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and many of the ministers in the government were all TPLF, including this man, who you might recognise as the current Director General of the World Health Organization. Under the TPLF, things definitely improved. Child mortality fell from 20% to 5%, there was basically no civil war, no serious famine, and the Ethiopian economy grew at a phenomenal rate. In fact, according to IMF and the World Bank data, Ethiopia was the third fastest growing economy in the world from 2000 to 2018, after Myanmar and China. Nonetheless, it wasn't perfect. There was an expensive border war with Eritrea from 1998 to 2000, elections were a sham, and political opponents were killed or jailed on dubious grounds. There was also a lot of corruption and some questionable fiscal management, with Ethiopia's debt to GDP ratio rising from 24% in 1997 to 60% in 2018, with nearly half of all external debt owed to China. The TPLF were eventually ousted in 2018 after two of the other factions in the EPRDF, the ADP and the ODP, joined forces to elect Abiy Ahmed, an ex-soldier who isn't Tigrayan but is instead half Oromo and half Amhara. Abiy and the TPLF really didn't get on. Abiy called the TPLF daytime hyenas and referred to their 27-year stint in power as the 27 years of darkness. So his coalition eventually split from the TPLF to form the Prosperity Party. Originally, the international community were infatuated with Abiy. He freed political prisoners, appointed women to half of all ministerial posts, and promised a free and fair election in 2020. In 2019, Abiy even won the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating an end to the decade-long war with Eritrea. Today, the international community's adulation for Abiy looks premature and a bit naive. Abiy delayed his promised election due to COVID, and when the TPLF held their own elections in September of last year, he cut off all funding to the region, triggering a civil war between Abiy's federal government forces and the TPLF. There have been reports of ethnic massacres, artillery shelling on civilian areas, mass rapes, and perhaps worst of all, deliberate efforts by federal forces to prevent international aid from reaching Tigray. Even Abiy's much-fated peace agreement with Eritrea now looks more maliciously motivated. Eritrean forces have sided with federal forces to attack Tigray, and have also been accused of ethnically motivated war crimes. Although Abiy denies these charges, a report from the World Peace Foundation concluded that the starvation was intentional, systematic, and widespread. In response, Abiy has banned Médecins Sans Frontières and the Norwegian Refugee Council, and even expelled 7 senior UN officials, accusing them of meddling in its internal affairs. Abiy now regularly rages against alleged foreign interference, and state media is flooded with laughable conspiracy theories, including, for example, that America is supplying TPLF fighters with drug-laced biscuits, and that UN agencies are secretly smuggling weapons. He finally held his long-promised election in July of this year, where his Prosperity Party won 90% of available seats, thanks to an opposition boycott and Abiy's decision not to hold votes in 20% of districts because of violence. You get the point. Abiy's not all he was cracked up to be back in 2019, and he's currently at war with the TPLF. So how's this going for him? Well, not brilliantly. In late November, after just a month of fighting, Abiy's forces declared victory, having taken Mekele, the capital of Tigray. This was premature. The reason federal forces were able to capture Tigray so quickly was because the TPLF, who've since rebranded as the Tigrayan Defense Forces, or TDF, retreated to the mountainous rural areas in the centre of Tigray, where they consolidated and begun a guerrilla warfare campaign against federal forces. Given that the TPLF fought guerrilla wars against both the communist regime in the 80s and Eritrea in the late 90s and early 2000s, this is something they're pretty good at. In June, after the TDF recaptured Mekelle, federal forces unilaterally declared a ceasefire. The TDF didn't agree to it, and by October they'd captured most of Tigray, and even some of Amara and Afar, forcing the federal forces to restart fighting. The TDF's expansion into Afar could be part of a plan to reach National Highway A1, which links the capital to one of the major port cities. 95% of Ethiopia's cargo traffic travels on the A1, and it supplies federal forces with most of its oil. The TDF have also been accused of war crimes, including civilian massacres, but it's worth noting that the bulk of war crimes have been attributed to federal forces, and perpetrated against ethnic Tigrayans. The TDF have also now joined forces with other militias in the area who are also opposed to Prime Minister Ahmed, including the ALF and OLA. So what happens now? Well, as we mentioned in our earlier videos, this is an unwinnable war, which is why it's been going on for nearly a year now. Federal forces don't have the capacity to wipe out the TDF, and the TDF don't have the capacity to regain control over all of Ethiopia. The only good outcome here is some sort of negotiated peace agreement, but that isn't forthcoming. Abiy has made it clear he doesn't plan on negotiating. He recently described the TPLF as a cancer, and the TDF, emboldened by their recent success, aren't going to stop fighting anytime soon. If the fighting continues, some 2.2 million Ethiopians, mostly in Tigray, are at serious risk of famine, and thousands more will die as a direct result of fighting. In August, the African Union opened a mediation process to try and sort out a ceasefire, but this is unlikely to work because the TDF don't think the African Union are impartial, in part because they were too slow to condemn the Ethiopian government's behaviour in Tigray, and also because they declared Abiy's election victory legitimate. The only real hope for Ethiopia is that Western governments step in, but not much has happened on that front so far. The US, the EU, France, Germany and the UK have all called on Abiy and the TDF to immediately enter into ceasefire negotiations, but that's about it. A UN arms embargo would help, but China and Russia are preventing the UN Security Council, which on October 6th discussed the conflict in Tigray for the 10th time, from even condemning the expulsion of UN officials, much less imposing strict sanctions. The only thing Western governments can do is block Ethiopia's IMF loans and impose trade sanctions to put financial pressure on Abiy. Essentially, unless someone does something, this war and its accompanying humanitarian damage will continue indefinitely. A sad prospect for a country that only a couple of years ago was hailed as the future of democratic Africa. So what do you think? Should Western governments intervene, or is this none of their business? Was it always naive to expect Ethiopia to transition from an ethno-federalist state straight into a unitary democracy? As always, let us know in the comments below. Also, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram for more TLDR content. You can follow just the TLDR global socials, or of course just follow whichever TLDR accounts interest you. Anyway, following and sharing our posts not only gets you more from us, but it really helps us out a lot too, so thanks a lot. And of course, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified whenever we post a video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of the videos, you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.